believe, and we began writing. And so in 1989, Paul and I published this book called Unfounded Fears, Myths and Realities of a Constitutional Convention. 6 years ago, next month, Paul passed away, still not having made me a believer. But I recently wrote to Professor Lessig to say that I had read his 2009 article in The Nation called How to Get Our Democracy Back. And I said to Professor Lessig that he may have convinced me that Paul was right all along. So my assignment today is to present briefly what were really Paul's responses to fears of a runaway convention. And remember, Paul was working, as I was, on this book as political scientist, and so Paul was focusing specifically on what he thought were political constraints on the scope of a new convention that might be called in the modern era. And he had 6 of them, and they're in, interestingly enough, chapter 6 of this book. So the first one Paul mentioned was the character of delegates to the convention. Now, Paul assumed that they would be elected rather than, in Sandy's view, to be chosen randomly. Paul thought they would be elected, and he thought that they would be men and women of character, and therefore they would not run away. Second, he thought that media attention to the discrepancies between what these people would have campaigned on as delegates or potential delegates, their campaign statements and promises, that media would focus on those if there were discrepancy between those and what they ultimately were talking about at this convention and ultimately what they decided at the convention. Number 3, he thought that the number of delegates and the divisions within the convention itself, which would make it, he thought, extraordinarily difficult for one faction or a radical position to prevail. Sort of a Madison Federalist Paper number 10 approach, where you'd have factions fighting each other, but you wouldn't have a bad faction in the end rise above the others. Fourthly, he thought that delegates' awareness that the convention results, of course, still had to be presented to Congress, which might not forward any amendments that were too radical or that went beyond the convention mandate. Paul saw that as a political constraint. And then fifthly, he thought that the Supreme Court could declare certain actions beyond the constitutional powers of the convention. So he thought that was another check on the process. And sixth and finally, he thought the need to get the proposed amendment ratified, of course, ultimately by 38 states, as Sandy mentioned, would be the ultimate check. Now, what I wanted to end with today was to say that I think part of the reason that I wasn't convinced by Paul in the late 1980s is that I could never get over the hurdle of seeing the need to call a convention